So how many books have you read and just completely forgotten? And how many times have you thought, I'm not even going to bother reading, because you didn't finish that last book, and reading and trying to remember things feels like a little bit of a chore and a bit pointless? Well, I find these issues come up again and again with reading, especially long books or textbooks that you need to learn something from, whether that's at school or for an exam, or for your own self-development. So in this video, I'd like to share with you how to become a better reader, because a lot of these issues come from the fact that we read way too passively. Whether you use a Kindle or read a physical book, we're pretty comfortable with highlighting something, saving a section of it, or folding over a page in a physical book to bookmark it as we go along. But once you're done with that book, we often pop it onto our bookshelf and leave it at that. Now, in my opinion, when you finish a chapter or when you put a book down, these are the critical times for learning and activating our brains to make the most out of what you've read and to go over what you've highlighted as thought-provoking points of interest. But instead, we often just tend to move on to the next book, and all these learning points are lost as we're all so busy. Now, to combat this issue, I have a system that I use every single time I read a book, and I wanted to share it with you today. Because of all the learning and productivity hacks that I use, this one I would genuinely recommend that everyone adopts, as it's one that I wish I'd started doing way sooner. It's not that complicated, and to make things even easier for you, I've included the links to a free Google Doc and Notion template in the comments below if you just want to download it and get on with it. So let's get started. So the first part of the system is simply about switching up how you collect together your highlights and focuses on creating micro summaries of each chapter or section to capture your thoughts at the time. As we read through a book, we'll naturally be drawn to thought-provoking and eye-opening information that we find relevant. This might be a threshold topic that suddenly unlocks our understanding of something, it might be a key fact, it might be an emotive story, or it might just be a really great explanation of a unique concept that changes our perspective on something. Typically, we'll highlight a sentence or save a Kindle note, or if I'm reading a physical book, I'll turn over the corner of the page to help me to more easily locate it in the future. This is natural and it feels pretty quick. What I'll usually do here that many people don't do is to then actually note down the page number or link my Kindle highlight or Readwise insight into a centralized note summary for that book. If you check out the template that I use, I'll typically add these at the end in the section called Key Pages and Notes. I'll usually do this at the end of each chapter or section, where I'll spend a quick 10 to 15 minutes skimming back over the chapter I've just read and linking my highlights into that note summary. Now, I don't link them in as I go along so that my reading is focused and I'm not distracted. I'll then jot down a really basic micro summary of that chapter and almost add in a kind of stream of consciousness to really activate my brain. This might be something like some bullet points with the key takeaway messages or my own personal opinions about something that I've read. For example, in this summary of James Clear's Atomic Habits, I've micro-summarized that the first chapter is all about compounding, which is a term used mainly in finance and which is also touched on in the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This helps me to quickly activate my brain and relates a concept of prior knowledge to aid learning and avoids forgetting that information. So when I come back to this note again, I'll quickly be able to jump to the key points and to other books, and it only takes like 15 minutes extra at the end of the book section, and I'll add the info on my phone or screenshot it to the central note summary to save time if I'm on the go. You can put all these bits down at the end of the note, as the rest of the system happens after you're done reading the book. So the next part of the reading system is key, and this is about thinking about the key learning points from the book and what you're going to take away after having read it. Now, before I started using this system, when I used to read books, I just highlight things or fold over a page and that was it. And the problem there was that you just forget things with time. So I made a switch to now at the end of a book, I'll review the contents page again, I'll review the notes and highlights I've made, and I'll try and pull out 3 key learning points that I've taken away from reading the book. I'll try and challenge myself to get down to just 3 key learning points so that I really have to think about what the most impactful things are, but if I've genuinely learned a lot, I'll add some extra lines in here too. These are usually new concepts or ideas that the book has introduced me to, and I'll keep it personal so that it isn't just a generic book summary, but something that I've personally learned from reading this book. So to use the example of Atomic Habits again, one thing I learned was that it's the daily small habits and processes that facilitate these habits which are more important to focus on than simply setting a goal. Now, next up in the system to read better is quotes. This is pretty self-explanatory, But if there are any sentences or quotes that are referenced in the book that have inspired me or which I find motivational when I'm reading, I'll add these into my summary verbatim. I find these untouched quotes really helpful in my note summary as they remind me of the style and language of the book, and I might want to use them again in future videos, presentations, or talks where I'm quoting from the author directly and referencing them. And by adding these down here in my template, I don't then need to go back digging through the book to try and find them in the future. Often the author has really researched things in detail and you can't really get a more concise summary, or they've quoted someone else, so you're building up these snapshots of really powerful quotes around the topic you're reading about. You can do this for fiction books too. If there's a really great quote or section from a fiction book, make sure you write it down, even if you're not using the full system and template as you would for non-fiction texts. For Atomic Habits, this looks a little bit like this quote from James Clear, where James says, "What separates winners from losers is a system of continuous small improvements that the winners implement which help them to achieve their goal." This is really motivational and also practical, as it kind of summarizes what the first few chapters are about. So I note this down verbatim. Before I use this system for reading, I'd often identify key concepts in a book and might apply one or two to my own life, but unless something really blew my mind and changed my mindset, I'd usually just continue about my daily routine. What I make a conscious effort to do now is to relate any learning points and key takeaways from the book to my own life and consider how I'm going to actually apply them. I'll specifically think about how the book's impacted me, what I felt when I was reading the book, and what I'll change in my life after having read it. And I'll use specific statements to outline what I'm going to change based on what I've learned. Every single time that I find something interesting in a book or highlighted in a book, I'd take a second, either while I'm reading or if I'm in the flow or in the zone, I'll do it after I've read the book, and think about how this can be applied to a change for my life, so that I have to think actively about how it applies to me. So for example, again using Atomic Habits, I might highlight as a learning point that focusing on who you want to become rather than what you want to attain is the most effective strategy to modify our behaviours. But this is a bit generic, and so to make this learning point personal, I need to convert this highlight into something directly relevant to me, rather than just a concept or story about somebody else. So I might say that rather than setting a goal like, I need to go to the gym every day to get in peak physical condition, which is very outcome-based, I'll change this up to be a correct identity-based approach, which would be for me to think that I'm already in peak condition, therefore as a fit and healthy person, I'll go to the gym regularly, which will then lead to continued peak performance, putting identity before outcome. Now this is a really important step, as it puts any theory or simple passive reading into action with a personal example. You'll want to practically do whatever you write down here. So going back to Atomic Habits, one of the ways I applied the book to my life was that anytime I set a big goal, I'd break this down and look at the daily incremental habits and processes I needed to implement in myself to get there. Now, one thing to note here is that you don't need to always stick to applying what you've learned from the book. Think of this step more like a bit of an experiment, where you're field testing a concept prior to using it regularly. If you apply something from the book and it works great, absolutely continue to do it regularly. But if it doesn't, at least you've had a go and tried it out, and you can move on without any costs. Part 4 of the system to read more effectively is an extra step that only really applies to certain books, such as self-development books. These books will often have exercises or practical things for the reader to do or practice which lead to a new way of thinking. These might be self-assessment exercises, or a meditation exercise in a mindfulness book, or just rhetorical questions to get you thinking. In Atomic Habits, James Clear suggests that the reader asks themselves a few questions when trying to change their habits. Firstly, how can I make the habit obvious? How can I make the habit more appealing? How can I make it easier? And how can I make it more satisfying? So I'll jot these questions in the exercises section of my note summary. They're kind of ways to apply what you've learned, but are way more specific and formulaic. Another great example here is from The Power of Now, where there's a self-meditation for the reader to practice, focusing on the moment. This is a super helpful practical thing that I can now come back to in my note and access anytime. If you're applying this to a textbook or studying for an exam, you might want to note down any worked examples or end of chapter summary questions so that you have these all in one place. So to summarize the reading system that I use that revolutionized how I read, whenever I'm done with a book, I now have this kind of summary page that has all of the information I've learned from the book in note form. I'll typically use Evernote, but I've added a link in the comments below to a generic Google Docs version of the template and a Notion template too. The summary note has my key highlights and notes in the book, my key learning points, key quotes, and how I'm going to apply what I've learnt to my own life, as well as a section with any quick practical exercises that I can jump into when I come back to it. By using this system for reading, I'm able to remember pretty much everything I read, and my reading becomes a lot more active than it used to be in the past. Instead of kind of rushing through books and not thinking about them, I'm forcing myself to engage my brain at the natural breakpoints like the end of a chapter or the end of the book itself. And as I'm making notes, I'm actively thinking where they'll fit into the template and how I might implement any learning points into my life as I go along. Since starting this, it's made my reading much more focused and consequently more beneficial and more enjoyable, especially when reading business books or any heavy textbooks. So the challenge for you watching this is to now try this out and implement this new reading habit to see if it works for you. Now, if you're interested in books, I actually share my own summaries of books that I'm reading broken down in this template format in my free newsletter, which I've linked down in the comments below. And you can download the actual summary template that I use in the comments too. If you have any note-taking or reading tips, I'm always super keen on learning about them or any books that you want to recommend, so do let me know about them in the comments below. And I've also put up a video here which I did on how to read more effectively, as well as some tips on how to remember everything that you read, which I did a little while ago. So definitely go and check out those videos. Thank you so much for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you again in the next one.